It was one of those long evenings at the Grand Hotel restaurant, the kind where the lights gleamed like gold and soft music played from hidden speakers. The place smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. Guests sat around white tables covered with crystal glasses and silver spoons. Laughter mixed with the sound of plates being set down gently. Everyone looked happy, or at least tried to. In the corner, behind the shining counter, a young waitress moved quietly from table to table. Her uniform was clean but worn at the sleeves. She carried trays so smoothly that nothing ever spilled. Her name tag read only her first name, but nobody ever really looked at it long enough to remember. To most of the guests, she was invisible, just another face that brought them food and disappeared again. She had learned to smile even when she was tired, to listen politely to every rude or careless word, and to hide her feelings behind calm eyes. But what nobody knew was that she carried something deep inside her, something that never quite went away. Before life became about paying rent and working double shifts, she had dreamed of being a pianist. Not the kind who plays for tips in restaurants, but someone who played on real stages, where the sound of her music could fill an entire room and touch people's hearts. When she was a child, her mother used to save every small coin just to afford her lessons. They couldn't buy a piano, so she practiced on an old keyboard with missing keys. Her mother would sit beside her, eyes closed, humming along to every tune. But years passed. Bills grew heavy and dreams became something they could no longer afford. Her mother's health declined and the music lessons stopped. The keyboard gathered dust and reality took its place. Now she worked in this restaurant that belonged to people who never had to worry about the price of dreams. Every day she served those who seemed to have everything. Yet even when she was exhausted, her fingers would tap softly on the tray she carried, tiny rhythms that no one noticed but her. That evening, a big event was happening. The hotel staff whispered about it all day. A famous billionaire had booked the entire hall for a private banquet, a celebration for his new business deal. The management made sure everything looked perfect. The flowers were freshly arranged, the cutlery gleamed, and every waiter had been warned to behave flawlessly. When the guests started arriving, their cars lined up outside like a parade of luxury. The men wore tailored suits and the women shimmered in dresses that sparkled under the lights. Laughter filled the hall before the first toast was even raised. Everyone wanted to be noticed, everyone wanted to impress. The waitress moved among them quietly, refilling glasses, offering plates, and pretending not to hear the casual gossip around her. She didn't envy them anymore, not really. She had learned that money could buy comfort, but not kindness. Still, it hurt a little when she saw the grand piano sitting near the stage, covered with a thin white cloth, waiting for someone else to play it. The hotel had arranged for a professional pianist to perform during the dinner, but as time passed, the manager received an urgent call. The pianist's car had broken down on the way. There would be no music that night. The manager's face went pale, knowing the billionaire had a reputation for being impossible to please. When he was told the news, the billionaire didn't take it lightly. He was a man used to control, tall, sharp-eyed, and always surrounded by people who nodded when he spoke. He frowned and waved his glass impatiently. "No pianist? Unacceptable," he said. His tone made everyone around him uneasy. The room fell quiet for a moment before he sighed and muttered something about how hard it was to find good service. The staff froze, unsure what to do. The waitress kept her head down, hoping to blend into the background. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. While clearing a nearby table, she began softly humming to herself, an old habit that helped her calm down when the night felt endless. It wasn't loud, just a few quiet notes, barely enough for anyone to hear. But somehow the billionaire caught it. He turned his head toward her, curious. "Was that you?" he asked. She froze, not sure how to answer. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." He leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Disturb? No, you were humming. Do you sing?" She shook her head, trying to move away, but he wasn't done. "Then perhaps you play?" He glanced at the piano nearby, then back at her. "You look like someone who might know how." Her breath caught for a second. How could he have known? She opened her mouth to say no, to end this before it went any further, but something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't kind. It was teasing, almost mocking, like he enjoyed watching her squirm. The guests laughed softly, waiting to see what she'd do. The billionaire tilted his head. "Go on." he said, gesturing toward the piano. If you can hum, you can play. Let's see what you've got. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run into the kitchen and hide until the night was over, but she saw her manager watching nervously from across the room, silently pleading for her to go along. Refusing could cost her the job, so she forced a small smile and nodded. The crowd turned their chairs toward the piano as she walked slowly across the floor. The sound of her footsteps echoed in her ears. Her hands felt cold and shaky. She hadn't played for years. What if she couldn't even remember? What if she made a fool of herself in front of everyone? She sat on the bench and lifted the cover off the keys. The piano was beautiful, polished, smooth, the kind she used to dream of playing. Her reflection looked back at her from the glossy surface, pale and nervous. For a few seconds she just sat there, her hands hovering above the keys. The billionaire leaned forward with a smirk. "Any time now," he said. His words cut through the silence like a knife. She took a slow breath and began to play. The first few notes came out shaky, uneven. A couple of guests exchanged amused glances. But she focused on the rhythm, trying to remember the feeling of music flowing through her. The melody she played was simple, an old tune her mother used to love. As she played, the noise in her mind began to fade. The guests' laughter turned into distant murmurs. The weight of the day slowly lifted. For a moment, it felt like she was back in her small living room, the one with peeling wallpaper and the old keyboard. She could almost hear her mother's soft voice saying, "Keep playing, you'll get it right." Her fingers moved more confidently now, gliding across the keys like they had a memory of their own. The melody grew warmer, fuller. The billionaire stopped smiling. The guests stopped whispering. The music filled the hall gently, wrapping around everyone like a quiet spell. When she finished the last note, the room stayed still. There was no applause, just silence, a silence heavy with surprise. Then slowly someone clapped, followed by another. But before it could build, the billionaire raised his hand. It was, "Fine," he said, his tone cool, "but too dull. Play something that actually means something." The words hit her like a slap. She lowered her eyes, her hands trembling again. She had given all she could in that moment, but to him it was never enough. She didn't answer. She just stared at the keys, feeling the sting behind her eyes. The guests looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke. The billionaire leaned back, clearly entertained by his own cruelty. "Come on," he said, swirling his drink. "Play something that makes people feel alive." She didn't move. Inside, she was torn between anger and heartbreak. But deep down, a tiny spark began to glow. Faint but real. She wasn't done yet. For now, though, she sat there quietly, the soft hum of the chandelier filling the silence. Her fingers rested on the piano still, as if waiting for something, a reason, a memory, or maybe just the courage to play again. And as the night went on, no one could guess that this quiet waitress, the one everyone overlooked, was about to change the entire room with one song that would make even the coldest hearts fall silent. The room buzzed quietly after the billionaire's words, but it wasn't the soft, polite hum of an elegant gathering. It was the kind of uneasy silence that comes when people realize something unpredictable is about to happen. The waitress stayed seated at the piano, hands hovering above the keys, heart pounding like a drum. She could feel every eye on her, every expectant glance, and every whisper of curiosity slicing through the air. She remembered the way her mother had looked at her once, years ago, during a late-night practice. There had been no audience then, no judgment, only the patient belief that she could do more than she ever imagined. That memory gave her a strange courage. She drew a shaky breath, letting it fill her chest and then slowly release. For a moment it felt like she was standing alone in that tiny living room from her childhood, the dim light casting long shadows across the old keyboard. She could almost hear her mother's words, soft and calm. "Play like nobody's watching. Play from your heart." Her fingers touched the keys lightly at first, testing the feel, reconnecting with the piano as though greeting an old friend. Then she began a new melody, one she had composed long ago but never dared to share. It was different from the simple tune she had played before. It carried a weight, a story embedded in every note. The story of years spent fighting, hoping and dreaming in silence. The first few notes were soft, almost fragile, barely audible over the murmurs of the wealthy crowd. Some guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to pay attention or dismiss it as a fluke. But as her fingers moved, the melody deepened. It was no longer just music. It was emotion in sound. Each note seemed to pull at something inside the listeners. Memories, regrets, and long-forgotten feelings that had been buried under the glitter and luxury of their lives. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, a look of mild amusement on his face. He was used to having control, used to deciding what others could do, and here was this quiet waitress, barely known, barely noticed, defying the expectations he had set for her. The sound of the piano filled the hall, and for the first time he did not speak. His usual confident smirk faded slightly. The room grew quieter. The faint clinking of glasses stopped. Even the staff behind the counters paused, unsure if they should move or make a sound. The music didn't just fill the space. It seemed to take over, weaving itself into the very air. People stopped speaking entirely, their eyes turning toward the young woman at the piano. No one had expected a waitress to hold the attention of such a room, let alone with something so beautiful, so raw. She could feel the energy of the crowd, but she didn't let it control her. Instead, she let the music guide her. She played with every memory she had, every tiny fragment of hope she carried through years of struggle. Her mother's encouragement, the long nights of practice, the days when her fingers ached but her heart refused to give up. It all flowed into her hands and into the keys. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, not used to feeling anything so real. Luxury, wealth, and power had taught them to expect perfection and entertainment without effort. They were not used to honesty, not used to emotion they couldn't buy, and yet they could not turn away. Every note told them a story they hadn't realized they needed to hear. The billionaire sat frozen. He had heard many musicians, many performers, many who had tried to impress him with skill and grandeur. But he had never heard this. This was not about showing off or demanding attention. This was about telling a story, about inviting everyone in the room to pause and feel something genuine. Her eyes were closed as she played, but she could feel their attention on her. She could feel the disbelief, the shock, the awe spreading across the room. It was like holding fire in her hands, dangerous, fragile, and full of power. She played with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, knowing that any moment could change everything. As the melody grew stronger, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter that had once been there was gone. The whispers had faded. Guests were leaning forward in their seats, some holding their hands together tightly, others letting their eyes glisten with unspoken emotion. The staff watched silently, captivated by a scene they could hardly believe. Her fingers moved faster, not with panic, but with precision. Every note was intentional, every pause meaningful. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer just a girl at a piano. She was a storyteller, and the story she told was the story of everyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible. A few of the guests had tears in their eyes. Some clenched their hands over their hearts. It was impossible to stay indifferent. The sound reached places that wealth and power had never touched, places that only honesty and vulnerability could reach. And then she remembered something else, her mother's laugh. The one that came after a mistake, not harsh but encouraging. She smiled slightly as she played, letting herself feel the joy mixed with sorrow. Music was her language, her secret strength, and now it was no longer secret. The billionaire's expression had changed. At first there was disbelief, then curiosity, then a flicker of something like respect. He had never seen someone like this before. Someone who didn't beg for recognition but demanded it quietly with nothing but talent and courage. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as though trying to understand how this was possible. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The melody swelled and softened, rose and fell, carrying the weight of her years of struggle and dreams deferred. The room had become a vessel for her emotions. Every guest, no matter how powerful or wealthy, felt the pull of the music. There was no pretense, no expectation, only the raw truth that came from someone willing to bare her soul through sound. And then, just as she reached the climax of the song, she let herself pause for a moment, taking a deep breath. She didn't need the applause, didn't need the approval. She played for herself, for the girl she had been, for the mother she had lost, for the dreams that had survived against all odds. The final note lingered in the air, soft and persistent. It was like a gentle wave washing over the room, leaving a quiet calm behind. For a long moment there was no sound except the echo of the last chord. Then slowly a murmur began to rise, a low, shaky sound of recognition and wonder. Applause followed, growing louder with every clap until the entire hall was filled with it. People were standing, some wiping their eyes, others just breathing heavily, overwhelmed by what they had experienced. The billionaire sat still, not clapping at first. He was silent, as though trying to understand what had just happened. His usual confidence had shifted into something more human, awe, respect, and perhaps even humility. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Who taught you to play like that?" She opened her eyes slowly, the weight of the room pressing on her, but she smiled gently. "Life did," she said. It wasn't a boast, it wasn't arrogance. It was simple truth. She had endured, she had learned, and she had survived. And that was what gave her music its power. The billionaire studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. It was as if he had seen something in her that he had never encountered before. The other guests were still clapping, still murmuring, still trying to process what had just happened. Some came up to her, praising her, asking her name, wanting to know where she had learned to play like that. She answered quietly, graciously, without letting it change who she was. She knew that her life had shifted in that moment. Something inside her had changed. A door had opened that she had thought was closed forever. And while the world outside the hotel might still see her as a simple waitress, inside that hall, she had proven to herself and everyone watching that she was capable of extraordinary things. As the banquet continued, people talked about the performance in hushed tones. Some couldn't stop repeating the way the music had made them feel. Others were still in disbelief that someone so young, so unnoticed, could command the attention of a room full of powerful people. And the billionaire, though he returned to his drinks and conversations, couldn't shake the image of her at the piano. The courage, the skill, the heart. For the waitress, it was more than applause. It was validation, but also a reminder that her journey wasn't over. She had faced fear, judgment, and doubt, and she had emerged stronger. She knew that the world might still challenge her, might still try to silence her in other ways, but she also knew that she had the strength to keep going, to keep sharing her gift, and to never let anyone diminish her light again. That night, as she returned to her duties, the guests still talking about the performance, she carried herself differently. She walked a little taller, smiled a little more freely, and felt a quiet confidence that had been missing for years. The music had reminded her of who she was, and that reminder would stay with her forever. And though the banquet eventually ended, the story of the waitress who silenced the billionaire with one song had only just begun. The days after the banquet were strange for the young waitress. Everything around her seemed normal. The same hotel, the same long shifts, the same guests who barely noticed her. Yet something had changed inside her. She felt a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. Every time she carried a tray or refilled a glass, she remembered the notes she had played, the way the music had moved the room, and the way even the billionaire had been silenced. It wasn't just pride. It was realization. She had a gift, a real powerful gift, and for the first time she understood that it could open doors she hadn't thought possible. But at the same time, there was fear. She knew that stepping into the world of music again could be dangerous. What if people expected too much? What if she failed in front of others like she had once failed herself? The thought made her chest tighten. Meanwhile, whispers of her performance had already begun to spread. Some guests had shared stories with friends. Some had posted small videos online. And the story of the waitress who had silenced a billionaire began to float quietly through the city. The hotel management called her into the office one afternoon, not scolding her, but curious. "You played beautifully," the manager said almost nervously. "I've never seen anything like it. Did you consider taking music seriously?" She shook her head. I had to stop long ago. Life didn't give me a choice." The manager studied her for a moment. "Well, you've reminded everyone that talent like that can't be hidden. Just don't lose it again." It was strange to hear that. People usually ignored her. Now even the hotel staff seemed to notice her in a new way. Some gave her small nods of respect. Others smiled a little longer when she passed by. For the first time in years, she felt seen. But she couldn't forget the billionaire. His words had carried a strange mixture of challenge and fascination. She wondered if he would call her again, what he would expect, and if she was truly ready. One evening, weeks after the banquet, the young waitress was clearing plates in a quiet corner of the hotel when she saw him. The billionaire walked toward her, surrounded by his usual entourage, but this time he looked different. less arrogant, more curious. He stopped in front of her, eyes focused, as if he had something important to say. "You played well that night," he said simply, his voice low. "Better than anyone I've heard in years." She felt a rush of surprise. "Thank you, sir," she replied, keeping her voice calm. He studied her quietly, then added, "You could do more than just work here. You have something rare, talent that demands attention. Most people with your skill never get the chance to be heard." She looked down at her hands. I never thought I would get the chance again," she admitted softly. He nodded slowly. "I'd like to see you play again, properly. No interruptions, no trays, no orders. Just you, the piano, and the music." Her heart skipped a beat. Part of her wanted to say no. She had been hurt by expectations before. She had been judged and silenced in ways that left marks she still felt. But another part of her, and the part that had longed for music every single day and wanted to say yes, I think I could," she said, finally hesitating. "Good," he replied. "We'll arrange it soon. Don't disappoint me." His tone was firm but not cruel this time. There was something in his eyes, a hint of respect, even admiration. The days leading up to the private performance were filled with anxiety. She practiced quietly in her small apartment, the keys of her old keyboard becoming familiar again. The music she had composed years ago now felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her all this time. She worked late into the night, sometimes forgetting to eat, sometimes forgetting the world outside. Friends and neighbors noticed the change in her. She walked taller, smiled more, and seemed lighter in a way they hadn't seen before. Even her coworkers noticed. The other waitresses watched her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, knowing something had shifted, even if they didn't know the details. The day finally arrived. The Billionaire had rented a small private hall in the city, not the hotel this time. It was intimate, quiet, designed for listening. She stepped inside, carrying only herself and her music. The piano was already in place, polished and gleaming, a grand instrument that demanded respect. She sat down, feeling the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. But she remembered her mother's voice, remembered the nights she had played alone, remembered the courage that had allowed her to silence an entire room once before. She closed her eyes, let her fingers hover above the keys, and took a deep breath. The first notes were soft, almost shy, but they quickly grew stronger, more confident, more alive. She played with the memory of every struggle, every sacrifice, every small triumph she had endured. Each note was deliberate, full of feeling, full of honesty. The Billionaire watched from the front row, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her hands. He said nothing, but she could sense his attention. Not mockery this time, not challenge, genuine curiosity and respect. He was witnessing her world, seeing her truth, and perhaps realizing that talent like this could not be forced or owned. As the music swelled, the room became completely silent. The small audience, a mix of business partners, friends of the Billionaire, and a few hotel staff, sat motionless, unable to look away. The melody was raw, full of emotion, full of life. It was as if her entire journey, every lost opportunity and every dream deferred, was being poured into the sound. Some people's eyes glistened with tears. Others gripped their hands tightly, moved by a feeling they couldn't explain. The Billionaire, usually so in control, leaned forward, captivated. She had their attention completely, not through grandeur or showmanship, but through the simple truth of music. Minutes passed like hours. Every chord, every pause, every rise and fall of the melody told a story. It was a story of struggle, of hope, of courage, of survival. A story she had lived and now shared with strangers who were too privileged to have known pain so intimately. She played not for fame, not for recognition, not for applause. She played for herself, for the girl who had dreamed alone in a small room, for her mother who had believed in her, for all the quiet victories that had brought her to this moment. And then, the final note lingered, delicate and powerful, hanging in the air like a whisper that demanded to be heard. The silence after was almost unbearable, the kind of silence that stretches and deepens, making everyone hold their breath. The Billionaire was the first to speak. "I've never heard anything like that," he said, voice low and steady. He did not clap immediately, nor did anyone else. The moment was too sacred for simple gestures. "You've reminded me what talent really means." Slowly, the applause began, soft at first, then louder until the room was filled with it. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even crying quietly. They could not ignore what they had just witnessed. She smiled, feeling a strange mixture of relief, pride, and disbelief. She had done it again, not for anyone else, but because she could, because she had to. And this time she felt something different. The music had changed her audience, yes, but it had also changed her. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt small. She was not just a waitress. She was an artist, a storyteller, a force that could command attention with nothing but courage and honesty. The billionaire approached her after the performance, this time without the smirk or challenge. He extended his hand. "I want to help you," he said simply. "Not because I expect anything, but because the world deserves to hear more of what you have. If you ever want guidance, support, or opportunities, I will provide them." She looked at him surprised. For years, he had been a figure of intimidation, almost impossible to reach. And now he was offering something genuine, something meaningful. "Thank you," she said softly. I'll think about it." She walked away from the piano that night feeling lighter than she had in years. She knew the world could still challenge her, still try to silence her, still doubt her. But she also knew something far more important, that she had the courage, the talent, and the heart to face it all. For the young waitress, the journey was only beginning. The music that had once been hidden was now a beacon, a voice that could no longer be ignored. And as she left the hall, she realized that life had finally opened a door she had thought was closed forever. The echoes of her music lingered long after she left, a reminder to everyone present that true talent is not measured by status or wealth, but by the courage to share one's heart, even when the world expects silence. The night of the private performance had changed her, but the world outside the small hall waited as it always did. She returned to her apartment, carrying the quiet glow of accomplishment and the lingering thrill of the music. The piano keys still seemed alive in her mind, each note echoing, reminding her of what she was capable of. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Hope that wasn't whispered or hidden, but real and tangible. Yet as the days passed, reality slowly crept back. She returned to her shifts at the hotel, refilled glasses and cleared plates as she always had. Guests barely noticed her presence, even as some quietly whispered about the stories they had heard. The contrast was jarring. In the hall, she had been the center of attention, celebrated for her talent. Here she was invisible again, a waitress among many, expected to blend into the background. She tried to keep her head high, reminding herself that one day this would not be the case. But doubts crept in, small and sharp, threatening to shake her confidence. What if she could not rise again to that moment? What if the courage she felt that night was fleeting? A spark that would fade the second anyone demanded more from her. And then, unexpectedly, she received a message. The billionaire had requested her presence at his office. She wasn't sure what to expect. Was it praise, a challenge, or another humiliating demand? Her heart raced as she prepared for the encounter. She dressed simply, nothing flashy, just herself. Confidence, she reminded herself, came from within, not from a gown or jewels. The office was massive, quiet, except for the soft hum of air conditioning. He greeted her immediately, without pretense this time. There was no entourage, no audience, just him. His sharp eyes softened with curiosity, and the young woman who had changed the course of his evening weeks ago. "I want to hear you play again," he said, straightforward and firm. "No distractions. This time not a single person will leave until you're done. I want to see what you can do when you're given the full stage, the full silence and the full attention of those who are listening." She paused, nerves and excitement mixing together. The pressure felt immense. This was not a casual recital. It was a test of everything she had become and everything she had held back for years. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I understand," she said quietly. The piano was placed in the center of the hall. The lights were dimmed, leaving only the soft glow above the instrument. She sat, feeling the smooth keys beneath her fingers. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. She closed her eyes and remembered the first time she had silenced a room, the first time she had dared to play from the heart. That memory grounded her, reminded her that she had already survived the impossible once. The first notes were delicate, careful, testing the waters. She let her mind wander through every memory, every loss, every joy she had tucked away over the years. The melody grew slowly, tentative at first, then confident. Her fingers glided across the keys as if they had never forgotten, as if the years of waiting had only strengthened their precision and feeling. As she played, the audience, a carefully chosen group of business leaders and influencers, fell silent. The usual whispers, the casual glances around the room, all vanished. They leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on her hands, as if they were trying to see how such skill could emerge from someone they had underestimated. The billionaire sat near the front, watching her closely. He said nothing, only observing, learning, and listening. His expression changed over the first few minutes from curiosity to awe. The confidence and control he carried so effortlessly in his life could not shield him from the honesty and depth of her music. She poured everything into her playing, not just skill, but emotion. Every note was a fragment of her story, her childhood dreams, the nights of quiet practice, the sacrifices she had made, the pain of watching opportunities slip away. Each chord carried a piece of her heart, shared openly, vulnerably, without a single word spoken. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room. It was no longer just melody, it was narrative, living and breathing through her fingers. Some of the listeners felt tears prick their eyes. Some felt a stirring in their chest they couldn't explain. It was impossible to remain unaffected. She remembered her mother, the encouragement, the laughter after mistakes, and the gentle way she had always said, "You can do more than you think." That memory became a foundation for the song she now played. Every mistake she had ever feared, every failure that had haunted her, became part of the rhythm, part of the story, and part of the sound that was reaching every listener. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The melody carried her through sorrow, joy, struggle, and triumph. She lost herself completely in the music, letting it dictate the pace, the strength, the softness. The audience no longer existed in the usual sense. They were mere vessels receiving her story. She played for herself, for her mother, and for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. The billionaire's expression shifted again. He leaned forward, captivated, almost unable to breathe. No one else in his life had ever compelled him to stop and simply witness without commentary or control. This music was not performance for him. It was truth, undeniable and raw. As the song reached its peak, she felt a strange lightness. Fear had melted into confidence, hesitation into flow. Her fingers danced effortlessly across the keys, not because she remembered every note, but because she had lived every note. This was her life distilled into sound, and she was ready to share it fully. The final sequence approached, the part she had composed in secret, the song that had lived in her heart for years but had never been shared. Every chord, every pause, every crescendo was intentional. It was the culmination of everything she had endured and everything she had become. She struck the final note with a flourish, letting it hang in the air longer than necessary, letting it linger like a breath that refused to leave. Silence fell immediately after, a heavy, complete stillness that made everyone in the room hold their breath. No one moved, no one spoke, no one dared break the moment. The music had taken control, and everyone had surrendered to it. Even the billionaire, the man who had rarely been silenced, remained still, his usual composure gone. He could not speak. He could not move. He could only watch and listen, absorbing the weight of the song, the depth of the talent, and the courage of the woman who had brought it to life. Then, slowly, the room reacted. A quiet murmur spread like a soft wind before a storm. One person clapped, then another and another. The applause grew steadily, building into a roar of recognition and admiration. Some guests stood, some wiped their eyes, and some simply remained seated, overwhelmed by the experience. She sat there, hands resting lightly on the keys, feeling the energy of the room. She was exhausted, yes, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came from pouring one's soul into creation. She had given everything she had, and the room had responded not to skill alone, but to the honesty, the courage, and the heart behind it. The billionaire finally approached her once the applause settled. His expression was unreadable at first, then softened into something rare, genuine respect. "I've seen a lot in my life," he said quietly. "I've rarely seen anyone command attention like that. You're extraordinary." She looked at him, exhausted but smiling. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't need to say more. The music had spoken for her. That night, she left the hall feeling lighter, freer, and more confident than she had in years. She had faced fear, expectation, and pressure and had emerged stronger. Her music had not only touched others, it had reminded her of her own worth, of the power she had always carried but had nearly forgotten. The story of that night spread quietly at first, shared through whispers, social media posts, and conversations among those who had witnessed the performance. People began to talk about the waitress who had silenced a billionaire with one song, about the music that could not be ignored, and about the courage it took to stand in front of power and play truthfully. For the young woman, the music was no longer a secret, no longer something hidden in the corners of her apartment. It was alive, real, and acknowledged. She had crossed a threshold, from quiet survival to undeniable presence. And though her journey was far from over, she knew, deep in her heart, that this moment would forever change her. From that night on, whenever she sat at the piano, she remembered the silence, the awe, the applause, and the power of playing from the heart. She had learned that true music did not come from perfection, nor from practice alone, but from courage, honesty, and the willingness to share one's soul with the world. And she knew, with certainty, that no matter what came next, she would never let her music be silenced again. The days following the private performance felt surreal. The young woman returned to her usual routine at the hotel, carrying the quiet pride of her music and the memory of the way the room had fallen silent that night. But nothing about her world looked different. Guests still ignored her, colleagues still moved past her as if she were invisible, and life continued with the same rhythm of orders, trays, and polite smiles. Yet something inside her had shifted irreversibly. She had proven to herself and to those who had witnessed it that she had a gift that could not be denied. The music she carried in her hands was alive, and it had the power to touch people in ways money and status never could. She could feel it whenever she practiced in her apartment, letting the notes flow freely, filling her small space with sound that was hers alone. News of her performance, of course, had begun to spread. Whispers and quiet conversations turned into small news articles online, sharing the story of a waitress who had silenced a billionaire with one song. People were fascinated, curious, and inspired. The story traveled fast, not because of her job or her background, but because of the sheer power of her music, the courage it took to perform, and the way she had captured an entire room with honesty alone. One afternoon, as she carried a tray to a table of wealthy guests, a small crowd gathered nearby, some taking photos with their phones, others quietly observing her as she moved. A sense of unease washed over her. She had never wanted attention like this, never sought it. All she wanted was to play, to create, to share her music without expectation. Yet here it was, growing larger every day, the world beginning to take notice. It was then that she received a call from the billionaire himself. He asked her to meet him in a private location, away from the hotel, away from the casual eyes of the world. Her heart raced as she prepared, unsure what to expect. Would he ask for another performance? Would he offer help or make demands? The unknown felt heavier than any piano key she had ever pressed. When she arrived, the office was quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound, every footstep, every breath, feel amplified. He greeted her without his usual entourage, without the aura of command he often carried. This time there was something different in his eyes, something like respect, curiosity, and perhaps even humility. "You played magnificently," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "I've never witnessed anyone capture a room the way you did. I want to help you if you're willing." She blinked, caught off guard. "Help me?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "Opportunities, support, connections. I want to make sure your music reaches the people it deserves to touch. Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden." The words felt strange, almost foreign. For so long she had been overlooked, ignored, and underestimated. And yet here was someone powerful, someone who had the ability to open doors she could never have imagined, offering assistance without expectation, without control. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt gratitude, fear, and cautious hope all at once. "I never expected anything like this." He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "You've earned it. All I ask is that you continue to share your music, that you don't let it be silenced again. The world needs it, and you need to give yourself a chance to grow." After that meeting, a series of invitations and opportunities began to arrive. Music teachers, local performers, and even small studios reached out to her, wanting to hear more, to help her refine her talent, to provide platforms for her music. At first, she felt overwhelmed. So many people, so many expectations. But then she remembered the power of that one night, remembered how music had carried her through fear and doubt, and realized she could do this. She could step into the life she had dreamed of without losing herself along the way. Even the hotel began to treat her differently. Colleagues who had once ignored her began to smile, to greet her warmly, sometimes even asking her about her music. Guests began to recognize her, not just as a waitress, but as the woman whose talent had silenced a billionaire. It was strange and a little unnerving, but it was also affirming. She had been invisible for so long, and now finally, people were paying attention, not to her job, but to her heart and her skill. Still, it wasn't just praise or recognition that shaped her days. There were challenges too. Some people doubted her abilities, some questioned the story, some whispered that it was luck or coincidence rather than true talent. But she had learned to carry herself quietly, to let the music speak louder than words. She knew that judgment was part of life, that recognition would always come with scrutiny, and that her strength lay not in avoiding doubt, but in facing it head on. The music itself became her sanctuary. She practiced daily, sometimes for hours, sometimes late into the night, discovering new melodies, composing pieces that carried her emotions, her memories, and her dreams. The notes became a language of resilience and courage, a reminder that she was no longer the girl who had stopped playing years ago. She had returned to the piano with a purpose, and every chord reflected a part of her life she refused to forget. One evening, after a long day at the hotel, she sat at her apartment keyboard, fingers poised above the keys, and let the music flow. The melody she played was both familiar and new, a combination of the pieces she had performed in front of audiences and the songs she had kept secret in her heart. As she played, she remembered the faces of the guests, the silence that had filled the room, and the astonishment of the billionaire. That memory alone fueled her, pushed her to explore deeper notes, more complex harmonies, and emotions she hadn't yet revealed. Her friends and neighbors noticed the change. She walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and carried herself differently. There was a light in her eyes that had not been there before, a quiet assurance that she had faced fear and come out stronger. The woman who had once been invisible was slowly becoming someone who could not be ignored. The most profound change, however, was not in the way others saw her, but in the way she saw herself. She no longer doubted her worth, no longer questioned whether her talent was enough. She had faced the scrutiny of a powerful audience, had silenced a room of skeptics, and had emerged with her heart intact. That realization was transformative. She had learned that courage and honesty were as vital as skill, that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. As invitations continued to arrive, from music studios, concert halls, and even small festivals, she began to see the path before her. It was not easy, nor was it without obstacles. She would still face judgment, doubt, and moments of fear, but now she had the experience, the talent, and the courage to navigate those challenges. She understood that her music was not just a gift for others to admire, but a tool for herself to grow, heal, and inspire. One day, the billionaire called again. This time, he wanted her to perform at a larger event, one that would include influential figures from across the country. The stakes were higher, the audience larger, and the expectation immense. Yet, instead of fear, she felt anticipation. She had survived scrutiny before. She had silenced doubt before. She could do it again. The day of the performance arrived. She approached the piano, her hands steady, her heart calm. The room was filled with people, all waiting, some curious, some skeptical, some expecting to be impressed. She sat, let her fingers rest lightly on the keys, and closed her eyes. The first note she played was soft, gentle, testing the waters. But as the melody grew, so did her confidence. Each note was deliberate, each pause meaningful, each chord full of emotion. The audience was captivated almost immediately. The wealthy, powerful, and influential all fell silent, unable to look away. They were listening not to a show, but to a story. The story of a girl who had once been invisible, who had faced doubt, and who had returned to the music stronger than ever. By the time the final note lingered in the air, There was complete silence, a pause so profound that it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then slowly applause began, quiet at first, then growing louder until the entire hall erupted. People rose to their feet, some weeping softly, some cheering, some simply staring in awe. The billionaire, who had watched from the front row, finally spoke. "I've never seen anything like this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You're extraordinary," she smiled, exhausted but fulfilled. She had faced the fear, the expectation, and the challenge, and had emerged victorious. Her music had touched the hearts of everyone in the room, and more importantly, it had reminded her of her own power, courage, and worth. From that night on, her life changed irrevocably. Invitations continued to pour in, opportunities multiplied, and her music reached audiences she had never dreamed of. But she remained grounded, humble, and true to herself. She remembered the long years of struggle, the nights of quiet practice, the doubts and fears she had carried alone. And she played not for fame, not for recognition, but for the joy, the memory, and the truth of her journey. She had silenced rooms, captured hearts, and proved to herself and the world that true talent, combined with courage and honesty, could overcome fear, doubt, and invisibility. And as she played each note, she knew that this was only the beginning of a life filled with music, purpose, and endless possibility. After the performance that had captured the hearts of everyone present, life began to shift in ways she had never imagined. Invitations continued to arrive from music schools, concert halls, and even international festivals. People wanted to hear her play, to share in the honesty and courage of her music. Yet despite the opportunities and recognition, she remained grounded. She remembered the years she had spent in quiet practice, the small apartment, the long shifts at the hotel, and the feeling of invisibility that had once defined her days. Those memories reminded her that every note she played carried a story, a truth she could never forget. Her mornings were still spent preparing for work, serving guests and tending to the details of the hotel. But now there was a quiet confidence in her movements. Guests who had never noticed her now paused to smile or ask how she was doing. Colleagues treated her differently, not just with respect, but with genuine curiosity about her music. She had become a symbol of courage, a living example that talent could not remain hidden forever. The billionaire continued to follow her journey. He offered guidance, connections, and support without demanding anything in return. Their meetings were not about control or expectation. They were conversations about growth, creativity, and opportunity. Sometimes he would sit quietly while she played, listening to her compose new melodies, occasionally offering practical advice about performance or public attention. But mostly he watched with quiet admiration, fascinated by the resilience and determination that radiated from her every gesture. She began to travel to small performances, each one carefully chosen to challenge her without overwhelming her. She played in halls filled with hundreds of strangers, some wealthy, some curious, some skeptical. And each time she felt the same mixture of fear and excitement, the same rush that had carried her through her first performance for the billionaire. But now she also felt mastery. She had learned to trust herself, to let the music flow naturally, and to embrace the vulnerability that made her performances unforgettable. Every time she played, she thought of her mother, the woman who had encouraged her to practice late at night, who had believed in her when no one else did, who had reminded her that mistakes were part of learning, and laughter could follow even the hardest lessons. Those memories were the foundation of her courage, the reason she could play without fear. Every note she struck carried a piece of her mother's voice, a tribute to the love and support that had shaped her earliest dreams. With every performance, the world began to take notice. Articles, videos, and social media posts shared her story: the waitress who had silenced a billionaire, the young woman who had faced doubt and fear and emerged stronger. Some audiences traveled just to hear her play. Others were inspired to return to passions they had abandoned, reminded that talent and perseverance could overcome long odds. She had become more than a musician. She had become a symbol of hope, proof that the human spirit could shine even in the quietest, most unlikely places. Despite the growing recognition, she remained humble. She continued to work at the hotel, not out of necessity, but because it reminded her of who she was, where she had come from, and how far she had traveled. Every tray she carried, every guest she served, was a reminder that her life had roots, that her journey had started in small, unnoticed ways, and that humility and gratitude were as important as skill and courage. One afternoon, She received a message that would mark a turning point. The billionaire had organized a large, formal event, an evening designed not just to showcase talent but to celebrate it. He invited key figures in the music industry, influential personalities, and media representatives from across the country. He asked her to perform not just for him or for the small audience she had grown accustomed to, but for the world. The weight of expectation was enormous. The hall would be grand, the audience discerning, and the opportunity life-changing. She could feel the nerves settling into her chest, but they were tempered by the quiet strength she had cultivated over months of practice and small triumphs. She had faced fear before, and she had learned that courage did not mean the absence of doubt. It meant moving forward despite it. The night of the performance arrived. The hall was filled with hundreds of people, each attendee holding their own expectations, judgments, and curiosity. She walked onto the stage, her hands brushing lightly over the piano keys. The lights were warm, not blinding, and the audience's silence was almost tangible. Every eye was on her. Every breath seemed to pause in anticipation. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began. The first notes were gentle, tentative, but quickly grew in strength and confidence. She played with all the skill, emotion, and honesty she had gathered over the years. The melody told a story, her story, and of struggle, perseverance, and hope. Every chord carried her history. The quiet nights of practice, the years of waiting, the moments of doubt, and the triumphs that had followed. The audience was captivated almost immediately. They were not merely listening. They were witnessing a transformation. The music flowed around them, pulling them into her world, compelling them to feel what she had felt, to see the world through her eyes. Some leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide with astonishment. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. The room was completely still, united in shared awe. The billionaire watched from the front, arms crossed, but his eyes were wide, his usual calm demeanor replaced by quiet astonishment. He had seen her perform before, but this night was different. She was no longer the nervous waitress testing her courage. She was an artist in her full power, commanding attention without arrogance, sharing truth without hesitation. Minutes turned into a journey of sound and emotion. Each section of the piece built upon the last, flowing seamlessly from softness to intensity, from sorrow to joy, from hesitation to triumph. She lost herself completely in the music, as if her hands were guided not by skill alone, but by every memory, every feeling, every piece of her journey. The final note came, soft yet resonant, lingering in the air like a whispered promise. Silence fell immediately, a profound, almost sacred stillness. No one moved. No one spoke. The audience held its breath, unwilling to break the moment, unwilling to let the spell of the music fade. Then, as if the world had remembered how to breathe, applause erupted. First soft, then growing louder, until the entire hall was filled with cheers, claps, and cries of admiration. People rose to their feet, some weeping, some smiling, some simply staring in awe. She sat at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, overwhelmed but grounded in the knowledge that she had done what she had set out to do. She had shared her truth. The billionaire approached her after the performance, his expression unreadable at first, then softening into something rare and human, awe and respect. "I've watched many performers," he said quietly, "but I've never seen anyone command a room like you. You're extraordinary," she smiled, exhausted but fulfilled. "Thank you," she whispered. There were no words that could fully convey the depth of her experience, the gratitude she felt, or the triumph of standing in her own power. The music had spoken for her, and it had been heard. From that night on, her life changed completely. She traveled to perform at larger halls, collaborated with musicians and composers, and began to build a career that had once seemed impossible. She received letters from people inspired by her story, young musicians who had been afraid to share their talent, adults who had abandoned their dreams and were now rekindling them. She had become more than a performer. She had become a source of inspiration, a living reminder that courage and talent could overcome fear and doubt. Yet despite the fame and recognition, she remained grounded. She returned to her apartment, to her quiet practice sessions, to the simple joy of playing for herself. She remembered her mother, her first piano, the nights she had spent alone, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Those memories were her anchor, keeping her connected to the person she had always been, even as her life changed dramatically. The billionaire continued to support her, but their relationship had evolved. It was no longer about challenge or control. It was about respect, mentorship, and recognition of talent. He watched as she grew, offering guidance when asked but never overstepping. He had been the first to see her potential, but she had done the work, faced the fear, and built her own path. Years later, she looked back on the journey, from the quiet hotel shifts to the grand stages of the world. She remembered the first night she had silenced a room with one song, the fear, the doubt, the courage, and the triumph. She realized that it had not been just the music that had carried her, but the determination to believe in herself, the willingness to face challenges, and the courage to play from the heart. Her life had changed. Yes, but the lessons remained. Talent must be nurtured, courage must be embraced, and honesty in expression is more powerful than perfection. She had become an artist not only by skill but by heart, by resilience, and by refusing to be silenced. And as she sat at the piano, ready to play yet another piece, she knew the music would continue to guide her, inspire others, and remind the world that true greatness comes not from status or wealth, but from the courage to share one's soul. The journey had begun with fear, continued